What is up, everybody? This is the Sharp Angles podcast, the Thursday edition, the Thursday fantasy football edition of the Sharp Angles podcast. I am Raymond Summerlin, and I am joined every week, as I am, by the Swami of Konami himself, the number one Joshua Dobbs supporter. That is Mr. Rich Hribar. How you doing, Rich?
We're doing good. I don't know if Joshua Dobbs is gonna start out of the bye. We'll see. I don't know. Monday night wasn't exactly the greatest thing on his resume this season.
No, I didn't. It didn't go. It didn't go well. We'll say that it didn't go well for him on Monday. That's how we'll put it kindly. Yeah, it was interesting that it had been such a fun story. They're like, oh yeah, we're doing awesome. We're gonna make the playoffs with the Vikings, and then like one terrible game. To be fair, it was terrible, but one terrible game. Like, yeah, maybe Nick Mullins could start. Like that's all. That's all it took. That's the story of Josh Dobbs' career. He's fine for the Titans. They're like, yeah, we'll try somebody else. We'll draft Will Levis. He's fine for the Cardinals. They're like, nah, then we're done. We're done with you when Kyler's back. And then now with the Vikings, maybe can they waive him and can he take over the Jets when Aaron Rodgers and inevitably gives up this nonsense of him coming back from this
It'd be
Achilles
amazing.
injury this quickly? That would
Yeah.
be that's the ideal scenario for me. Is he plays for three of the teams that pick in like the top five. All three of them had Josh Dobbs as a quarterback at some time. That'd be great. That's ideal for me.
Yeah, get back to the Browns. It'd be fun.
It'd be perfect. So we are actually normally we do this every single Thursday morning at I guess every single non-Thanksgiving Day Thursday morning. I guess I have to add that in now. But every single Thursday morning at 11:30 a.m. Eastern over on the Sharp Football YouTube channel. Just go to YouTube, search Sharp Football. You'll find the channel. You can subscribe, get notified whenever we go live. I say normally at 11:30 because it was 11:35 today because old man Rich Hribar can't click on a link and work a and work a computer.
It
I guess
happens,
you
man.
said that's the second time that's happened to you.
Yeah. The Restream wouldn't let me in. They keep they made me log in when I don't have a login set up. Yeah, this is what it is, man. Hey, you forget when you're on a time crunch or anything, how much you are at the mercy of all this stuff, right? Or
Absolutely.
earlier in the season, I lost power for a day. I don't know if you remember that.
Yeah, I recall. Yes.
It's you just forget how much we're at the mercy of all the stuff just working as it's supposed to.
My favorite thing about you losing power that day is that we were in the middle of a meeting and your face just froze and we're like, what happened to Rich? And then we just get a text message. Well, I lost power. I guess I'll see y'all in like 6 hours. And then it was some absurd time frame they gave you. Like, well, it'll
Yeah.
be like 1 hour or 13 hours. We don't really know how long the power's.
Yeah, that's what it was too. Yeah, it was fun, but yeah, it's just crazy, man. It's yeah, hey, podcast man got podcast.
Yeah, I mean, we gotta get on here. We gotta let people know all of our thoughts that we've have about this week 13 schedule. I mean, they're dying to know all of our thoughts about this schedule. Before we get there, though, I do want to mention you can head over to sharpfootballanalysis.com. You can find a bunch of content. A lot of that content we're going to talk about here, at least reference here today. You can find Rich Hribar's worksheet previews. They are amazing. They are comprehensive. Every single thing you want to know about every single fantasy player playing this weekend, you can find those in the worksheet previews. All of that is part of our fantasy package, which you can get for 15% off by heading over to sharpfootballanalysis.com and using the promo code ANGLES. Angles. You can use the promo code Angles like the name of this podcast, and there we go. I tried to spell it one time recently, and I spelled angels instead of angles, and so I'm not going to spell it anymore. I'm not going to spell it anymore, but angles. That is our promo code. Another interesting thing we have over at the website right now is Warren Sharp released kind of a rest of season strength of schedule. One of the interesting things he does every offseason is a strength of schedule based on Vegas win totals, which is fascinating. Now, obviously, we have a lot more data points with team efficiency and stuff like that. So just based on the strength of schedule the rest of the way, who has the easiest run, who has the hardest run. And it's a really interesting read. He breaks down the top 10 seeds in every conference. I'd really highly recommend you go and read it. It's fascinating. It has a betting aspect to it because, you might be able to get some value on a team like the Steelers, who actually have a pretty decent run going in, whereas you might be a little bit more concerned about the Bills. And so
Of course
there's
they
there's some
do.
interesting stuff in there. Huh?
Of
Of course,
course they do.
yeah. They have don't they have so they played Joe Burrow's or they played the Bengals twice. They played him last week and they get to play them again without Joe Burrow because that is they live a charmed life, Rich. They live a charmed
They
life, the
do.
Steelers.
Yeah, I mean, the
But
Steelers fans are just it's interesting. It's got to be a roller coaster of emotions for them. Like I feel like they live on like a obviously they love their team. Like if you've met a lot of the Yinzers,
sure.
they bleed steel. But like this team has to be such like a polarizing team, like on a week to week basis. Like, do you really even like this team, or like do you like want them to just like get rid of all these guys?
So my whole family's from Western Pennsylvania. My whole dad's side of the family still lives there and are Steelers fans. And I see some interesting Facebook posts about the Steelers every now and again. That is yeah, it's interesting. It must be fun to be a
They're back
Steelers
now,
fan.
though. They're back now.
We're in. We're in. So gonna talk about that later. If we believe in the Kenny Pickett assance, is that what we're gonna call it? The Kenny Pickett assance. We're gonna talk about that here in a little while. However, I did want to get into one interesting thing Warren put in that article was looking at the defensive strength of schedule the rest of the way and then breaking it down to passing defense and run defense. And there were some interesting names to come out of that list. So you can get the full list over, like I said, at Sharp Football Analysis. Go and check it out. But I wanted to, kind of take this real or fake idea that we do and kind of apply it to
Sure.
this list of players, the strength of schedule that we see coming out over the next, over the next several weeks, including the fantasy playoffs. One of the more interesting names is Sam Howell, because Sam Howell actually, according to Warren, has the toughest remaining pass schedule for any quarterback in the league. He gets the Dolphins, then a bye, then the Rams, the Jets, the 49ers, and the Cowboys. It is a I guess on the surface a tough schedule, but I kind of like a lot of these and what I'm seeing is I look at these schedules and it seems like if you have a really tough kind of run, which Jets, 49ers, Cowboys is really tough, then it kind of gets skewed a little bit. But I don't know. I'm
Mhm.
not that scared of the Dolphins. I'm not that scared of the Rams. So it's interesting to see. But the cool thing about Sam Howell, the interesting thing about Sam Howell is we've already seen the wheels start to fall off over the last 2 weeks. He's propped himself up with a rushing touchdown. And now you add in the fact that we have a bye week left. We're going to have to face a terrible run of games, the Jets, 49ers, Cowboys at the end of the season. Are we just going to see the wheels fall off here for Howell the rest of the way? We've been so reliant on him as like, yeah, we can kind of trust this guy as a, back in QB1, high end QB2. It feels to me like that might not be the case the rest of the way.
Outside of the Jets, I don't think there's like another one of those games that I don't necessarily think I'm like scared of. If you're looking at like the tandem as like that back end QB1, like more of like you always trying to treat him as like a high floor QB2, right? Like that's how I always like view him. And then if you get like the spike week, you can. But he only has 3 games as a top 6 scoring quarterback anyway, so he's just living through all this volume. And that's why I bring up the Jets game, because that might be one of the games where like they just don't have to like keep up this pace of throwing the ball 45 times a week, because he's thrown the ball 40 or more times in 6 straight games, and he threw for 300 yards against the Cowboys, right? So like 49ers, Dolphins, that Cowboys game again, like he's gonna throw the ball 40 times in those games. The Jets game's the one where you're like matchup plus volume equals bad. The other games, though, I still think he's going to throw the ball enough to have like some viable counting stats to where like he won't be a complete brick. But I do think you want to treat him more as like a high floor QB2 anyways. That's how I've been trying to like handle him for the most part. Like we see him finish as QB10, right? But like we don't regularly want to be starting him as like our like locked in one quarterback guy.
That's kind of where I am with him is I just think there's a lot more, there's a lot more fragility to him than maybe it seems like if you just go through his game log. I think there's a lot more fragility to kind of his performances. They are entirely, well, not entirely, but they're very highly predicated on volume. And I do wonder, if we don't get that one week, or if just like the Cowboys game, he didn't get touchdowns and he still got that rushing touchdown and that worked out for him. But how much are you going to rely on that? I just think maybe we've been running a little hot, and maybe this is just another example of you're not going to be able to rely on him in single in regular season fantasy, but also in DFS. He probably is a player I'm going to be shying away from more in DFS. Where I think if you've been playing him in DFS, you've been very happy with your results. Another quarterback on this list on the other end is Patrick Mahomes, a higher profile quarterback. Dare I say, Patrick Mahomes is a better quarterback than Sam Howell. Do you think that that's fair, Rich? Do you think I'm going to get much pushback on Patrick Mahomes being a better quarterback than Sam Howell? Patrick Mahomes has been good as a fantasy player, but he hasn't really been
Great.
the ceiling player that we've expected, that we've come to expect from Patrick Mahomes. He has probably not repaid his draft value in the way that you thought he would. But the rest of the way, he actually has a pretty easy run. He has the fifth easiest remaining pass schedule: the Packers, Bills, Patriots, Raiders, Bengals, and Chargers. So I wonder if, as they tune up here for the playoffs, as they try to make this push for the number one seed, are we going to see this offense really open up, and we're going to see more of these ceiling games that we've come to expect from Patrick Mahomes?
Yeah, I'm not sure like he's ever gonna get back to being like that top three guy. It's one top three scoring week on the season. So I'm not sure. And like the state of his wide receivers and the way they still just are still unwilling to commit to Rashee Rice, still is kind of like a problem. So it's just like one of these things like he's gonna have to run hot on touchdowns, which he's capable of doing, but I still see like a
Yeah.
scenario where because Travis Kelsey is, and it's just the state of the tight end position, but like Travis Kelsey's not having nearly as good as a season as he had last year too. It's just like this offense is just missing the ancillary components to kind of get him like that big push, right? So I think he's gonna be fine. I think he's gonna basically live as like a mid-range quarterback, probably still have another spike week or two, but he's not gonna be a guy that I don't think you count on just consistently being like a top three quarterback because he hasn't been either. And I just don't think that the pieces are here for him to be there in this offense.
I'm glad you brought up Rashee Rice, our obliged
Just play him the
one
whole
Rashee
game,
Rice.
Chiefs. Just play him.
So that's what I was going to say. We are coming off a week in which that kind of happened, which his usage really did spike. We've seen it in the past. We've seen false flags, we'll say, fitted with the podcast crew. We'll use that term, false flags. We've seen that from him already this season, and then they go back to not using him for reasons that remain unknown to me. I do not know why this is where we are with Rashee Rice. He is very clearly their best pass catching option as a wide receiver. It's not even close. Like it's not even close that he's their best pass catching wide receiver. I know that MVS is going to do MVS things, but there's another wide receiver spot for him. Maybe use him over Justin Watson. Maybe I'm just a bitter fantasy player. The other thing that I'll say about this though is I worry that several of these teams on this list are not teams you would expect to push the offense. And I think that's one of the things we've seen from the Chiefs this year is I don't know if they've been as willing to really push it if they don't need to. I mean, you're going to expect the Patriots to push them, not even a chance. The Raiders, I mean, the Raiders had some success last week against them and then just were absolutely shut down. The Bengals, the Jake Browning Bengals, no, I don't think they're going to push them. And this is kind of where you start to see this disconnect between fantasy production and like efficiency production.
Right.
And the Patriots are actually a really good example of this. The Patriots are top 5 in EPA per drop back allowed, which means they're giving up a ton of expected points added. They're not a good pass defense, but they're 27th in fantasy points allowed to quarterbacks per game because you don't have to throw against them. You just don't need to. And that's been changing a little bit with Allen and Tua and how all three of them kind of got there for fantasy. And their defense is not as good now as it was early in the season because of the injuries they suffered to, to Judon and to Christian Gonzalez, right? I don't know why I just forgot his last name, but there are issues here with the Patriots. But if the Patriots are going to score 7 points and bench their quarterback 7 times, then we're probably not going to get a spike game out of Patrick Mahomes.
Yeah, that's kind of where I think he's gonna. I mean, he still is like getting you those QB1 performances, those floors, and so like those turn into like maybe like more mid QBs and QB1 weeks, and you get maybe one or two peppered in. But he's no longer like on Team Jam him in like he was a year ago.
Yeah, which is sad. Which is sad. I miss the old
I mean, he's still
Mahomes.
balling though.
You
He's still
know,
good. Like like that throw he made to Kelsey last week, where he just basically threw it over a guy's helmet, was just like absolutely stupid.
no, yeah, he's still amazing on like a
Yeah,
per throw basis. It's still astounding. But yeah, we'll have to see. We'll have to see where we go from there. A player that maybe is not at his old level anymore is Austin Eckler, who I'll shoot you straight here, Rich. I have been quasi depressed about watching Eckler and kind of that run where he got loose for a long gain was a couple weeks ago
against
now,
Packers.
and he looked like he was running in cement, and it's very clear he's not healthy. And I hope he gets healthy, and I hope he gets paid, and I hope I really we'll see what happens with Eckler, but it's been rough. It has been rough for Austin Eckler since he returned from that injury. However, the rest of the way, he has the easiest remaining running schedule. He gets the Patriots, he gets the Broncos twice, he gets the Raiders, the Bills, and then he finishes up with a Chiefs team that may or may not need that game in week 18, although you probably don't play in week 18 anyway. And so, is there an opportunity here for Eckler? Are we going to see a return to more him being what we expect from him from an efficiency standpoint, or do we think this might just be a lost season because of his health?
I mean, I think it's similar in a way to what we went through with Tony Pollard for like a little bit of that, like the last month, and then how he's turned it around with some opportunity. I think with Eckler, what you say is like, I don't know if we're going to count on the efficiency coming back, but I do think when you look at a back that's getting 75% of his backfield touches, is still has major touchdown equity. Some of these matchups can elevate him into at least being, to turn in some really usable fantasy lines compared to what we've got in the past 2 weeks from him when he hasn't scored touchdowns. I don't think that we're going to see like explosive runs though from him, right? Like I don't think he's given us any reason to like believe that like he's going to turn back into this explosive player. But the touchdown equity stuff and the matchups and the amount of touches he can get still can create like him to be like a viable player, especially in this running back landscape. The bummer is he's not catching the football, right? Like that's the big thing is because you
Even when
can
he gets
circumvent.
targets, he's
Yeah,
dropping it. Even when he gets
yeah,
targets, he drops them. So it's
yep.
wild. It's just wild to watch.
But he does have these, like you said, he does have these spots like we would typically look for elevation, especially when you talk about Raiders, Broncos. Like those are two teams like we've been kind of honed in on for the stretch run of the season for getting there. So I do think there's some at least light on the end of the tunnel. Like if you have limped into the playoffs with Austin Eckler or like going to make it in with him, there's at least a chance to where like if he can fall into the box, like you're going to get enough touches against these teams, like for him to still have usable lines.
I do want to point out some stats that kind of backed up what you're talking about with that lack of explosion. So since returning from injury, he's got 3.2 yards per carry. 17.7% of his runs have been negative or zero runs. Just 4.2% of his runs have been 10 yards or more, which is that's a wildly low number. I'm glad you mentioned Tony Pollard because when we were worried about Tony Pollard's explosive runs, he was at like 8%, right? And
Yeah.
so we are seeing 4.2% and that's over a long period now. He's been back for a while. That's really terrible. You ask, is it the line? Is it him? He's only had 0.86 yards before contact over that span, but over that same span, Joshua Kelly's at 1.03, so he's better. ESPN has the Chargers ranked kind of mid-pack and run block win rate. And as we've talked about before, yards before contact is kind of a shared stat between the line and the running back, and you have to kind of choose which one is going to get the most blame. And I think Eckler deserves some of the blame there. So it's not just the line that's the problem. So it's it's a tough situation.
They've
But
had a
you brought up the
miserable
running back.
schedule. Like I tried to like get on Eckler a couple weeks ago because that first month back, like they had faced like a terrible just run of defenses,
Yeah.
and I'm like, all right, it'll haul pass here. Like it faced like a pretty tough gauntlet, and then that Packers game, I was in on him, and he actually sank like a really fire DFS lineup I had that was really cooking. And just like you said, that's when it like really looked. I was like, oh, this isn't just like all of the it's a combination of everything. It's the line, it's the schedule, it's where he is physically. It's just like all these things. Like we don't have to pinpoint and say this one thing is causing Austin Eckler to play like this. It's literally like the sum of all parts. That's what's happened.
Would you like so when you mentioned that lineup, you touched your face and like the look of just of just stored anger was so good there. I'm sorry. I'm sorry that he cost you
Yeah, yeah.
your
I'm
lineup.
sorry too.
That could be one of our off-season ones. I have a DFS regret story. Maybe we're gonna do some DFS regret stories. Yeah.
Yeah.
In the off-season. That'll be a fun listen
That game
for
dude too is the
everybody.
worst because he got like a goal line carry. I was like, all right, well at least he's gonna get this goal line carry, and he fumbled it, and I was like, oh god, what is
Oh
happening
man.
right now?
Yeah.
But I do think
Oh
they're,
dude,
like I
that's such a
said, like to at least be a viable volume-based contributor over some of these stretch of games. Like, I think there's going to be at least like you're going to get recouped more than we've gotten the past 2 weeks from him.
yeah, and
I
we
don't know
bring
about
this
this
up.
week though.
This week is I don't know. I don't know about this week either. But I'm glad you brought up that we talk about this way too much, but it's just the way it is. Whenever we're talking about a lot of these players of like Eckler's like level and ilk in fantasy, we always bring up, but I mean, you're going to play him because what else? Who else? You going to play Royce Freeman and hope that the Rams are able to control things the way they were last week, and he gets 10 second half carries? Like, what? Who else are you going to play other than Eckler? So that is kind of where we are with him. I do wonder, are we almost to the point though with Brees Hall that maybe I'll take a shot on somebody else? Like, Brees Hall has been so rough. That offense has been so terrible. He actually has the toughest remaining running schedule the rest of the way. The Falcons this week. That's a bad matchup for him. So, like, we're looking at Brees Hall. He hasn't been very good. What do we do with him? Is it the same answer that, well, I mean, who are you going to start over him, or are we really, really actually worried here about Brees Hall? And is he even like a viable option in a shallower league?
I mean, it depends how shallow. I mean, it's one of these things. Because unlike Eckler, like there's like no real light at the end of tunnel for the offense, right? Like Eckler still has like this touchdown equity. Like when the Chargers get inside the 5, like Eckler's still the guy getting the carries. The Jets got to get inside the 5 first of all. Like even hoping they get there is a thing. I mean, he hasn't scored a rushing touchdown since week 6, and that defense let him score that rushing touchdown. His last 2 touchdowns since that have been like these dump off passes that he's housed. That had really no business kind of being touchdowns. He hasn't rushed for 30 yards in a game in either of the past 3 games. And I think 4 of the past 5, he's been under 30 rushing yards. He's catching a lot of passes, but they're not really going for any yardage. It's just the offensive situation is so dire for the Jets right now that even Tim Boyle was worse than Zach Wilson. Like, it's how bad the situation is. And it doesn't look like, this, like you said, this Fugazi, like, kind of report that Aaron Rodgers is going to come back for any point. Like, why would he? What's the point? I mean, it's tough. So like Brees Hall, I think is more in like that volatile, like RB2 kind of flex zone, right? That's kind of where I treat him, because he's still like his overall touch count still aren't even like really that high because they can't run the football and they're getting flooded in these games. You're just counting on
They
these
can't
dump
run
offs.
plays.
Yeah.
Yeah, they don't run enough plays for it to be. Even if you're getting 80% of the touches and you run 20 plays, like, it doesn't matter. They just don't run enough plays because their offense can't stay on the field.
Yeah, he's completely dependent on explosives, really, right? Like, and we haven't
That is
seen
the
one
key.
for a while in the run game, but he's completely dependent on like just like having like this 150-yard play, like bolster his yards per touch, because this offense is just that bad.
So those are the 2 paths for him. You mentioned both of them. Is a big play, which we know he is capable of. We know he is capable of those big plays and really making something out of nothing. And then you mentioned it, the catches. He's had over 20% of the targets in the last 2 games. If he can just continue to stack 5, 6 catches per game, especially in PPR leagues, then that's going to be enough to get you through with him. But yeah, that's really what you're hoping on. Or I guess Aaron Rodgers to come back. It is. Can we talk about how impressive it is that the Jets managed to, for now 2 years running, have managed to field somehow worse quarterbacks than Zach Wilson? Like, they've had Zach Wilson and they've used Zach Wilson, and then they're like, okay, well, Zach Wilson isn't it, and so we're going to try Joe Flacco, or we're going to try Mike White, or we're going to try Tim Boyle. It's somehow, to be fair, Flacco and White are probably better than Wilson, but Tim Boyle was not. And so, like, that is amazing to have two quarterbacks of that level. The other thing is, I'm just going to go on the side here. Let's take an adventure, Rich. Have you looked at Tim Boyle's college stats?
Yeah, I have. I've
Tim,
written up Tim Boyle for 2 years of worksheets, and over the years when he started with the Lions in that stretch.
how is Tim Boyle in the NFL? I'm
That,
so confused.
yeah, he's buddies with
It's
Aaron
the
Rodgers. I mean, it's clear. It's very clear why he's in the NFL. He's friends with Aaron Rodgers.
Well, and so my thought is, like, maybe he's going to be like, maybe this is the Kellen Moore path. Like, maybe he's just a coach in the quarterback room and that's why he's there. But yeah, I
It
don't know
worked
how
for
he
Dalvin
was.
Cook. Like, you just need Aaron Rodgers to vouch for you, man, and you're gonna make a lot of money. Alan Lazard, Dalvin Cook, Tim Boyle.
Nolan Lazard's even getting Sundays off and still collected those game checks. So good on you, Alan. Which, I
That's the
mean,
other thing with the Jets
that's
too, is like you've seen the Jets now. They've started to play a lot of younger guys the past 2 weeks. Like, they really are just kind of like and the other thing that you've seen with the Jets 2 weeks in a row now, I think this defense is done with these guys. Like, this defense has not played the same as it did, because like they're just cooked, dude. Like, they've exasperated themselves this season. Like, and we've seen them now the past 2 weeks like really struggle defensively. And for good reason. They've been on the field the entire season. They've been asked to play perfect football for the entire season. They largely have played great, tremendous football defensively, but like asking a team to win that way in the modern era of football, even against the offenses in the context of 2023 football, it's just too hard to do.
Yeah, I mean, how long, if you were holding up your end of the deal and nobody else was doing their job correctly, how long would you continue to? That's just basic human psychology, and it has to be really tough for everybody on that defense to continue doing what they're doing, to watch the offense do that and just say, all right, I mean, am I really going to go hard? Am I really going to put myself at a risk for injury for us to lose 13-10 instead of 27-10? No, I like
Yeah.
it's
I mean, their tackling the
it's
past 2 weeks has been non-existent.
yeah, those are business decisions.
Yeah.
Making some business making some business decisions, and I don't fault any one of them. There is no fault I give to the Jets defense. That unit, I feel that way. Many of you know that I'm a Penn State fan. I feel about the Jets defense the way I feel about the Penn State defense. My goal is to get the Penn State defense to Washington somehow so we can have a very interesting college football playoff. We need to get the Jets defense to a team that to an offense that actually deserves it. Actually, that's a fun question. Who would we send the Jets defense to if we really wanted to make the playoffs fun? What team gets the Jets defense? The Lions? The Lions is the answer to that question.
Probably, yeah, they'd probably be, at the very forefront.
Can we do that? Can we trade an entire defense? Can I call up Roger and ask him? I'll call up Roger and ask him. Can we trade the Jets defense to the Lions and have a very interesting NFC? Speaking of the NFC, the first game we're going to talk about here today is the biggest game of the week. It's the biggest
Mm.
game in the NFC. The Eagles just continue to be in these games. We talked about this run of games before it started and like, oh, they might lose some games. Well, they're 3-0 on this run. Now they run into the 49ers this week. It's a fascinating game from a real life football perspective. This is this is a bigger game, I think, for the 49ers than it is for the Eagles, because if the 49ers lose this game, I think the number one seed is gone. Whereas if the Eagles lose this game, we're still playing for it. So I think this is a bigger game for the 49ers. But from a fantasy perspective, it's also interesting. Both of these offenses are good. The Eagles defense hasn't been playing great. The 49ers defense has been playing better since, the bye week, but they still have some exploitable holes. So it's going to be a fascinating game. And one of the interesting parts is the Eagles wide receivers. And we talked about this a little bit. I believe it was yesterday. We talked about this a little bit with what are we doing with these Eagles wide receivers? Do we think AJ Brown's going to break out of his funk here? Do we believe what Charvarius Ward was able to do on Thanksgiving? Like, how are you viewing kind of the AJ Brown situation? And then I guess kind of matched with that, what do you think about Devonta Smith this week?
Well, big picture, I think the Eagles are going to have to throw in this game. I mean, I think the 49ers are going to press them for sure. I mean, the 49ers are it's, obviously everyone's talking about like how the 49ers are favored, but like this is a spot to where like, if they weren't favored, like old Vegas heads would be all over the 49ers, right? Like you've got a rest advantage in favor of the 49ers team that played on Thanksgiving. You had the Eagles playing in a game that went to almost a full overtime. I know you used to be big on the full overtime games. The Eagles defense was on the field for
I am
9.
still big on the full overtime games.
Yeah, the
Just
Eagles.
you should look into those numbers, kids. Look into the full
Yeah.
overtime numbers and
I
get back to me.
remember NBC days used to always bring it up. And then the Eagles defense was on the field for 92 plays last week. And like this is a defense that's already like dealt with like a plethora of guys in and out of the lineup. They lost another linebacker in Zach Cunningham, which actually is going to be relatively important if he doesn't play in this game, especially the way we saw the Bills attack their linebackers in the passing game with their running backs. Guess who has a pretty good receiving running back? The 49ers. So I actually think the 49ers are going to press the Eagles here. It's not going to be like the Chiefs game, right, where it was like kind of lower scoring. I think it's going to be a situation where the Eagles have to throw. And if the Eagles have to throw, they're throwing the ball to two guys. I mean, since Dallas Goedert has been out, and we're assuming Dallas Goedert's going to miss one more game, it sounds like he's trying to play, but the medical staff wants to hold him out one more game. Follow that into the 11th hour if he ends up being out. When the Eagles have had Dallas Goedert off the field, they've thrown the ball 63% of the time to A.J. Brown or Devontae Smith. That means basically 2/3 of every throw is going to one of these two guys. That's it. So, like, it's pretty easy to say if the Eagles have to throw, these are the two guys we're going to focus in on. The 49ers have been beaten. They're most vulnerable, like on the perimeter and on the outside. Charvarius Ward played the best game of his 49ers career on Thanksgiving by far against DK Metcalf. It'll be curious to see if they ask him to shadow AJ Brown. Obviously, you're going to take AJ Brown against anyone, right? Like you're going to say like, please, like just let me have enough one-on-one chances to make plays, and we're going to at least throw those at the wind and say like, hey, he's going to cash in a couple of those because he's been so good against man coverage. The thing is, he's been good against everything that the 49ers typically have run this year, right? Like 49ers play a lot of quarters. He smashed against quarters. He's been awesome against cover three. They play a lot of cover three as well. And then, you've got Devontae Smith just on this like 2-year sample size now. When Dallas Goedert's out, Devontae Smith is balling. So I do like the Eagles receivers. I think that's the way structurally, probably if they're playing catch up, like this is how they hang around with the 49ers is by both of those guys doing a lot of the lifting.
I do think that this is not, it's not always the case that if you're playing Jalen Hurts in DFS that you have to double stack him because he has so many rushing touchdowns, so much rushing equity. But this is one of those situations where I think that if the Eagles are actually going to hit and their offense actually hits in this game, it's going to be through these two wide receivers. I am, like you said, I'm very interested in Ward. If Ward is going to shadow Brown and play as well as he did last week against DK Metcalf, that is a concern. I mean, AJ Brown's a better player. AJ Brown is probably going to get his, but we've seen AJ Brown struggle now for a few weeks as he's kind of come up against some of these tougher defenses. So that'll be interesting. I mean, I've been on it for several weeks. I've been on it several weeks. Devontae Smith without Dallas Goedert is a fantasy and prop betting cheat code. And you need to take advantage of it this week because, like you said, they're rough on the outside. And especially if they're going to take their best corner and follow along A.J. Brown, that even makes it better for Smith. So I successfully ladder bet Devonta Smith 2 weeks in a row. You can bet that I'm going to do it again this week. I am all in on him, and he's going to be somebody I have rostered in a lot of DFS lineups. On the other end, and I'm glad you mentioned like if they're going to have success, this is probably what we're looking at. This is going to be interesting for DeAndre Swift because it's a tough matchup. He's not getting the involvement in the passing game that I think we would like to see as fewer targets than Kenneth Gainwell over the last 5 weeks. But with Cam Jurgens back, this team is back to being the rushing team we expected. And so I wonder, we're probably not going to get a ceiling game out of Swift here, but I do think this is still probably going to be an okay game for him based on the efficiency we've seen the last couple of weeks.
I mean, the thing with Swift is you just the ire you feel if you're a Swift gamer, and when the Eagles get to the 1 yard line, because you ain't getting
Yeah.
that touchdown. You're not getting that.
Yeah.
Swift knows it too. There was a game earlier in the year where Swift got tackled on the 1, and he was you could see how mad he was because he knew, hey, my touchdown. I'm not getting in the box now. So that's what stinks for fantasy because we're still seeing Gainwell, and we've also seen Gainwell like get involved a little bit, like in the green zone a little bit. Like he's gotten a couple touchdowns, like inside the 10. He plays in the 4-minute drill. He plays in the 2-minute drill. So he caps the receiving upside that Swift has. Because when Swift doesn't score a touchdown, I mean, he's had a lot of these kind of meandering games where he's giving you like, they're okay, right? Like they're not burying you. They're just fine. And that's kind of what I think we're probably going to get here too. Like he's probably going to have like an efficient rushing game, I think, like on a per carry basis. But if you don't get that touchdown, like you're not probably going to flirt. It's probably not a game where he gets 100 rushing yards, and he's probably not going to catch a lot of passes. So that's kind of the problem. But they have been great. Like I said, when Cam Jurgens played, we had the splits in the worksheet. He's averaging 6.3 yards per carry. He's got an explosive run on 15.6% of his carries with Jurgens in the lineup. And it's not just a decline. It's almost the exact same sample size. He's averaging 3.4 yards per carry with 2.4% of explosive run rate with him off the field. So like he's been a vital part of and that was with Lane Johnson out last week too. Remember, Lane Johnson didn't play in that game last week, and Cam Jurgens did, and he still was able to get those explosives and be just under 6 yards per carry. So there'll be some opportunity, I think, for having some efficient runs. But again, like you said, if you don't get that touchdown though from DeAndre Swift, like we're kind of just floating in that like okay line.
Jurgens one, I throw some side eye at some splits. The Jurgens one feels real. That feels like a real thing.
Well,
That
those two
we,
backup
that we,
linemen they have are awful on the right side. Like
yeah,
Driscoll is terrible. Like their backups are bad that have had to play on that right side of the line this season. So when Lane Johnson left that Jets game early in the year too, like, and Hurts was just under siege in that game.
yeah, that's important, and that is another thing to mention. By the way, Lane Johnson and whether he's able to play this week is an important factor with this Eagles offense. On the 49ers offense, like I don't even really know what to talk about with the 49ers offense. they have their four skill players in Brock Purdy, and sometimes they're going to be good and sometimes they're not. And you just kind of have
You gotta do
to
it.
look at some signal and hope for the best and see what happens. This kind of looks like a George Kittle blow up spot, but I felt similar last week for him too, and that didn't happen. So I don't really know. What I will say is I think the Eagles have a better chance to push this team
Yeah.
and the offense than the Seahawks did. And so maybe we're going to see a more of a ceiling Kittle game. Again, it doesn't matter for season long fantasy because you're playing George Kittle and you're playing Brandon Ayuk and you're playing Debo Samuel and you're definitely playing Christian McCaffrey. And you're probably even starting Brock Purdy in a lot of leagues with the quarterbacks that we have on bye. But from a DFS perspective, Kittle is probably the most interesting from like a price to point uh, perspective for me from that game. Are you interested in him, or is there another pass catcher that you like here for the 49ers?
I am, but from the context of this DFS main slate, I think it's hard to get to Kittle because it's really him. He's like the only kind of like ceiling breaker that we have on the main slate. And anytime you have that, like with a tight end position, like it's actually more advantageous to just not play him and hope he fails because it
Yeah,
opens up so much more. So like
it's a good point. Yeah,
it's kind of a weird slate for him to kind of say like you have to force him. And I am interested in the matchup. I think there's an absolute opportunity that like he is like clear by far and away the tight end one on the main slate, but we live in a world of salary cap, and like, are you going to be able to you obviously can't get the Tyreek Hill, you can't get the Christian McCaffrey if you play him on this particular slate, even with the Zach Moss kind of leverage that everyone's going to has been afforded to. Just know that everyone's starting with Zach Moss in their lineup this week, and then everyone's going to have 8 other players outside of him. Basically,
what do you think Zach Moss, like if we go into like the large field
he's going to be
tournaments, what do you, is it, are
70%
we
owned, and he's going to be 70% owned in large field stuff, like for sure.
that that would be a wild, I don't know, that's a wild number. I was thinking like in the 50 to 55 range,
Oh no,
but
it's we had
70.
the Mostert game earlier in the year where he was 65%.
Oh, I forgot
Like
about that game. Yeah,
yeah, he's
yeah, I
gonna
forgot
be
about
there.
that game.
Daigle brought up on the show last night, like 2 years ago, and we had the COVID game where it was Dearness Johnson, like was just smashed in like that 1 week where all the Browns got COVID and Dearness Johnson was like min
Yeah,
priced. It's almost like that because his prices since Jonathan Taylor's come back, his prices dropped so low. It's one thing if his price would have stayed at like in the mid fives on DraftKings or like in the mid sixes on FanDuel, like it would be like where people would be able to say like, all right, I can at least get kind of cute here. And there'll definitely be leverage points where like he's not gonna be 100% owned, but he's
yeah.
so cheap and he gets so much volume. And on this particular slate, the way this sets up, where people want to get to Tyreek Hill, he's just going to that's going to impact his rostership too. So I would imagine I think he's gonna push 70% probably.
And we don't really dive into DFS strategy a ton. That's actually the show later. I will actually be on the podcast later talking about DFS with Todd
But
at
all that
7:30
impacts
Eastern.
Kittle in a roundabout way. Like that's how we
Exactly.
got there.
No, exactly. It all impacts Kittle. And I think you brought up an interesting point about that Moss Hill combo. If you're really trying to get a little bit of kind of uniqueness thrown in there, just having Moss without Kittle, maybe Moss with CMC, like, and going kind of that route and not using what you're saving to go and get the guy that everybody wants. But then you're but then you're hoping Tyreek Hill doesn't smash against a defense that he should absolutely obliterate. And so it's like you're in a tough spot because if you just start with Moss and Hill, I mean, you're duping with a lot of lineups at that point, and it becomes difficult to get unique in large field tournaments. So what you can do is you can just do what Rich does and just play small field and
Yep.
call it a day,
Yeah, I
and
mean, I have
hope for
like
the
the
best.
thin chance of just outright fading Zach Moss if I want. I mean, I'm not going to like in cash game environments and stuff like that, but like
Oh, yeah,
you play in
Cascades,
this,
you
you play in that
smash him in.
small field stuff. You have the opportunity to play like a Michael Pittman. I've been trying to think if this is like an old school like 2019 type of slate where you just try to get McCaffrey and Tyreek Hill in a lineup and just does like when we used to just play CMC or David Johnson with Antonio Brown and just like who gives a shit who else we play. I've been
Exactly.
approaching it like if that should just be the approach this week because quarterback doesn't have the ceiling breakers outside of Tua and Hurts. Like it's kind of wide open this week to where you can probably play like a scrub and be okay this week if Tyreek and CMC fulfill kind of what is set up for them this week.
Yeah, no, I it'll
But that's where I
it's
think the
gonna be interesting.
49ers have an advantage here, right? Like you're like to get us back full circle is, Nakobe
Yeah.
Dean's on IR. Zach Cunningham's got a hamstring injury, hasn't practiced to this point in the week. We'll see if he plays. Like you would expect the 49ers to kind of attack that area of the field because that's kind of where the Eagles are kind of down bad. They've also been bad on the outside though, too. Like, so it does kind of create this opportunity. If the Eagles do push the 49ers, do we finally get like a target game for Brandon Ayuk? If Brandon Ayuk just had targets, like he would be destroying, but he just doesn't get enough targets for fantasy football. And he has a touchdown in the past 3 games. And it's still barely floated him in 2 of those 3 games. But if we have a game where maybe, what if Ayuk can like get 8 to 10 targets this game? Then there's an opportunity for you to have like another stacking partner with Purdy.
Yeah, and then he's Tyreek from an efficiency standpoint, and he doesn't get the target. He's not quite Tyreek. Nobody's Tyreek from an
Yeah, yeah,
efficiency
but
standpoint, but he's in the at least
hmm?
the stratosphere of Tyreek. And so if you're going to get 10 targets from him in a shootout, yeah, that makes you a lot more excited about kind of stuffing him into DFS lineups
Yeah, I mean, the
as
Gabe
well.
Davis at 100% Gabe Davis for the same reason. And Brandon Ayuk's a lot better player than Gabe Davis.
Yep, exactly. All right, so there aren't many other great games for us to talk about this week. There are some kind of interesting situations. I want to hit on them real quick. The first one is Texans Broncos. And the reason I'm fascinating in this game is because of the way the Broncos have been playing over their win streak and the way they've been kind of, limiting possessions, limiting opportunities. They are 31st in pace and time of possession per play over the last 5 weeks. The Texans are 12th in pace. But when I started to dig, so I just kind of like off the top of my head, I was thinking about this game and it'd be interesting to talk about which style wins out. But when I started to actually look into like deeper into the differentials here, the play difference hasn't really reflected that for the Texans, that the Texans have been higher pace. Their Texans are 20th in combined plays per game over the last 5 weeks. The Broncos are 22nd. The Texans have been an under team this year. The under is 7-4 in their games. The under is 4-1-1 for the Broncos over their last 6. The total in this game is 47.5. I kind of think that might be too high. I still have that Panthers game stuck in my head that the Texans decided for whatever reason to take the ball out of Stroud's hand, and we saw kind of what happened to them. I don't know. I think we might be looking at an under game here, and I think people may be a little more excited for this game than they otherwise should be. Excited for Stroud because he's been amazing than they otherwise should be.
Well, I mean, it's just more like you've got 2 teams that are kind of trending positively. I know the Texans lost last week, but you got 2 teams that are in the mix. So it's one of, and we don't, with NFL slate schedule on a weekly basis has been like, just give us 2 games of competitive teams that are playing for something, right? Like that's, so like we have that here. So that's why it's drawn some optimism and hope for people, even outside of the fantasy football community. So they're just looking for competitive football. I think we'll at least have that, but I'm with you. It does feel like from a fantasy side, it feels like a trap spot for expecting like an explosive game. The Texans have had a really nice run of facing some really awful defenses the past month. And the Broncos, like definitely they're probably somewhere in the middle of where they were the opening, month of the season to where they've been these final 6 weeks. But when they have been tasked to punch up against like the Josh Allens of the world and the Patrick Mahomes, like they have rose up and limited those quarterbacks too as well. So like you said, when you look at Stroud's like schedule, the last time he faced like a competitive defense was the Panthers, and he flatlined. The week before that, he faced a competitive defense in the Saints and was just a back end QB1. I think that's probably what you're looking for if you have him, is just like a solid floor game, right? Like he definitely has upside any week now. Like we've seen, like that's who Stroud
Sure.
is. But I think that's probably from a realistic stance against this matchup is you ding him and you say like, all right, I just hope I get like a solid, like 15 to 18 point game and it just doesn't bottom out like the Panthers game. But I do think from like a DFS stance, from a fantasy side, if you've been riding Tank Dell, I think I even wrote in the worksheet, like this is probably the first time like a month I haven't played Tank Dell in DFS. That's probably where we're looking for. Like those guys, you're all starting in your season long leagues, but I think you do come in with a little bit of tempered expectations on the Texan side. Because a lot of these guys we have been riding. The one guy I will say that I think that probably is undersold though is Devin Singletary. Like he probably still looks really good because the Broncos, as good as their pass defense has come around in the course of the season, like their run defense is still hot garbage. And we've seen the Texans can't run against anybody that can defend the run. and the teams that are like the bottom dwellers, like the Cardinals and the Bengals, like they've been able to run on. So this could still be a spot where Devin Singletary ends up being like the overlooked asset in this game.
Yeah, I agree with that too. I am also interested, like, if this is right, and if we do get a higher scoring game, which the 47.5 total in the year of our Lord 2023 is basically like 53. And so if we do get a higher scoring game here, then I am interested to see what this Broncos passing game looks like. And can some of the efficiency we've seen from like a touchdown perspective, EPA perspective, can they keep it going if Russell Wilson actually has to throw? Will they transition and throw deep a little bit more than they have been instead of relying so much on the short passes? He's turned into, I'm glad that you keep mentioning the worksheet. I think it's 100% right. He's turned into James Harden. He is either taking three pointers or he is at the rim, and that's it. Those are his only options.
Yep.
And so, also his teammates might not like him very much, but that's a story for another day. And so, the James Harden, as I'm working through the James Harden analogy in my brain that I just thought of, it all fits out really nicely. Grow a beard, Russ. We'll see how it goes. But I think that, yeah, are we going to see fewer of those layups and more of those deep shots if they are actually forced to push? If the Texans have learned the lesson of the Panthers game and still come out and really try to push against this defense, it'll be interesting to see kind of that situation. That it's at least a fascinating game. I don't know if it's a great game.
That's the whole path, because I was really close to, writing Russell Wilson up as a trust. I'll probably still have him as a tournament option given the context of the slate, because you really only, if Tua fails, then it's kind of a wide open board this week. But
Yeah.
it's the reliance of the Texans, kind of like the Texans are the wild card in this angle, because if the Broncos defense is still like limiting the Texans offense and we don't get that pushback, like we know what the Broncos are going to do. Like they will
Yeah.
hand it off to Javonte Williams for 3 yards of carry until our eyes bleed. Like that's just like kind of what, if they're afforded that opportunity, because this Texans pass defense is flipped from last year. They were a pretty okay pass defense and awful against the run. And then obviously game script, like we would play every running back against the Texans, but they're low key been awesome against the run all year. And it's shown up now finally in the statistically, like their back end is starting to like really struggle. And we've seen guys like Ritter and Baker Mayfield and Derek Carr get there against this pass defense. So obviously with buys and stuff, I do think Russ is definitely on the board as like a streamer. But for him to like have a ceiling spike week, we need the Texans to have pushback here.
That we need them to push them, because the Broncos are very comfortable being a Big Ten offense, and if you allow them to just be a Big Ten offense, they will be one for the rest of the season for sure. One other quick game, and I don't even really want to go through the game per se, but I am interested in Kenny Pickett, as I mentioned at the top, the Kenny Pickett songs, and what we're going to. I'm sorry, our producer Sean, the Pickasons, which we're making up for the interceptions that he will likely start throwing and break all of our hearts very soon. But we saw them fire Matt Canada. We saw the Steelers fire Matt Canada. We immediately saw them have 400 yards of total offense, albeit against the Bengals, and they didn't really light up the scoreboard. So all of those are certainly caveats here. But one of the things I noticed with Pickett was there was a distinct and very noticeable change in the way that they were running this offense and the target tree for Kenny Pickett. Before last week, Kenny Pickett had 9.3% of his passes travel 20 yards in the air and 29.9% of his passes between the numbers. By the way, he had been super successful on those between the numbers passes. He had 8 yards per attempt on those throws versus 6 yards per attempt on his other passes outside the numbers. Last week, 12.1% of his passes were 20 plus air yards, and 45.5% of his passes were between the numbers, and he had 8.9 yards per attempt on those throws. Was that just because the Bengals can't cover tight ends and they finally got Pat Freiermuth involved? Is Pat Freiermuth finally healthy? Was this really a change? I don't know. We'll have to see. But that is a dramatic and seismic shift right after a coaching change. And to me, that is indicative that we're going to see some changes to this offense moving forward.
Well, they talked about it after the game. Freiermuth openly talked about it, and he said that was the plan based on what the structurally the Bengals were doing with how much too high they were running, was to use him like in particular in this game. So that also that's twofold. So it gives you one, at least like the coaching staff was adjusting to opponent, like
How about
positive
that?
development,
What a
positive
what a
development.
wild idea.
Positive development, but also there's a signal in there too that says like if they are going to adjust the opponent, like how static is like what he
Yeah,
did
it's
going to
fair.
be. So
Exactly fair.
but if the Steelers at least are going to start calling games based on like what the opponent's weakness is, that's a huge step in the direction from what we had. Because there are some opportunities when you look at, particularly this week, they play the Cardinals, right? This passive defense, like there's an opportunity to exploit them.
Run Jaylen Warren.
They
Just
play the
run him a
Colts.
bunch.
They play the Colts in 2 weeks. They play the Bengals again in the fantasy playoffs, and then they have a relatively game that's like against the on the road in Seattle for the fantasy championship. But
Yep.
like, there are soft spots to take advantage of here that you talk about from like a strength of schedule perspective. So it's more or less like, are we going to get cute and like stream Kenny Pickett? Maybe this week you can throw a dart based on the matchup in the bye weeks, but probably for the context of the rest of the season, like you're just hoping to get like some 2 QB run out from him. And not really over 1 QB stuff, but there are actual talented players in this offense. We would like to see like be usable pieces as a regular basis, right? Deontay Johnson, the ghost of George Pickens, Freiermuth himself, and
Yep.
who literally he led the NFL in receiving yards this past week. So I mean, they have assets that we care about, even if it doesn't mean that Pickett turns into a fantasy asset himself.
So I have on my Scott Fishbowl team, which by the way, last week, your team, can you carry those points over to this week on Scott Fishbowl? You scored
They
what, like
do, right?
315 in it?
Don't they just boost your average? So like I do get some
They
of them.
pushed your Goodness, that was a wild score from you. But yeah, my Scott Fishbowl team has Deontay Johnson, Pat Fryermuth, and Jaylen Warren. I am very much hoping that we are going to get a competent offense. Because I'm with you. In 2 quarterback leagues, maybe we get back to Kenny Pickett. Maybe some of my 10th place best ball teams will turn into 9th place best ball teams because we get some decent Kenny Pickett games the rest of the way. But yeah, can he keep George Pickens going? Can he get Deontay Johnson going? Fryermuth, can they, continue to lead into Jaylen Warren? That really is going to be the question for me down the way. And at least through 1 week, I'm hopeful, and we'll see where we go. All right, let's move on to my favorite segment, your favorite segment, everybody's favorite segment, and that is Uncut Gems. Looking at players that maybe could go a little overlooked that we want to play this week. Who do you got this week?
I've got Juwan Johnson. I did want to go with Torian Perry, but I didn't know who was going to actually be available for the Saints come Sunday. But and with tight end being the position it is this week, because there's not like we don't have outside of TJ Hawkinson, we're not like missing a bunch of like barn burning tight ends, but like we've got guys out this week that like gamers have at least been using, right? Like Dalton Kincaid and Cole Kmet. Like these guys at least been like hanging around for people and like been reliable sources of targets. So like tight end is really thin this week. So Juwan Johnson, given the assumption that maybe Chris Olave won't play, we know Rashid Shaheed's not going to play. Michael Thomas is on IR. We saw him run a route on 85% of the team dropbacks last week. And we know this Lions team has been kind of a team that has been weak against tight ends all season. We saw Tucker Kraft get into the box on Thanksgiving, thankfully. So, I mean, if you're really, down in the hole at tight end this week, I think Juwan Johnson is worth a guy kind of taking a shot on this week.
I really wish it was a different week that we were getting this out of Juwan Johnson because I have a dynasty team with he and Evan Ingram, and you're playing Evan Ingram this week
Yeah.
against the Bengals. Maybe I'll play both. That'll be fun. We'll see if we can play both. My guy, I don't actually know how under the radar he is, but I just wanted to point out that this week is set up very well for Tyler Algier. This game environment is perfect for him to get carries. The Jets are not a bad run defense per se. They've been kind of more mid-pack over the last 5 weeks, but they face a ton of volume because their offense is awful, and the Falcons' defense is good enough to continue keeping their offense awful. And whenever you have these game scripts that fit what the Falcons want to do, we've seen Algier get carries. He has 15.8 carries per game in wins and 9.3 in losses. He has 44.9% of the running back carries overall, but he has 61.9% of the carries when they're winning in the second half. So if they're winning in the second half, we're going to get to stack some usage here from Algier. The one thing I will say is you're not going to hope as much for a touchdown as you maybe would early in the season because we've seen Bijan Robinson take on more of that goal-to-go role, at least when they've been down there recently. But I mean, we've also seen them use Algier in that role too. So maybe you even get a touchdown out of this. I'm not saying he's going to have a massive spike week, but if you get 15 for 70 out of him and maybe a touchdown, I think that's a pretty good outcome, especially with the bye weeks we have this week. So just it's a week that works for him. Week 13, what are you looking for? I feel, do we have more than one really good game? I mean, we're recording this on Thursday. If you're listening to it on Friday, we haven't seen the Seahawks and the Cowboys. I am hopeful Please, Seahawks, do something. Like, poke them with a stick, do something. But I don't know if we're going to see it. I guess
I
it's just
hope.
49ers Eagles this week. I guess that's the one, right?
Yeah, I mean it's these Thursday games have just been a real big letdown. It's hard, we tried to get up for Bengals, Ravens a couple weeks ago, and that ended up turning just where everyone died. The day I
Nightmare.
traded for Jamar Chase in like my one league that I like actually care about. Now I'm gonna ride him catching tip passes every week and hopefully catch
Can
enough
I
of those.
can I one up you on that one? So I traded Jamar Chase and ended up getting back Jonathan Taylor.
Nice,
so things are
cool.
so things are going great, kids. Things are
Yeah.
really going well for me.
No, but yeah, Eagles 49ers definitely a hot game. I am curious to see and I know like it feels weird to say out loud, but like if Joe Flacco plays, if there's a level of competency, just because the Browns players splits outside David Njoku with and without Deshaun Watson, and not like Deshaun Watson is even playing well, are so dramatic. I mean, they just getting any level of functional quarterback play has been so big for any of those guys in that offense. So I'm curious to see like if he's like actually like functional. And then other than that, to see maybe do the Dolphins score 70 again.
Yeah, that is within the realm of possibilities here. I pull it up his stats because it's just fascinating to me. Dorian Thompson Robinson has 109 attempts so far this year. He has 429 yards. He is averaging 3.9 yards per attempt. 3.9 yards per passing attempt. There are bad running backs who average more than that per run. That is where we are with this offense. So yeah, can Joe Flacco hasn't been good with the Jets over the last few
No.
years. He's joining this team late. Can he do better than 3.9 yards per attempt? Probably. And as Curtis likes to bring up, if Joe Flacco starts, you play David Njoku because David Njoku is getting 1,000 targets if Joe Flacco is playing. So you play David Njoku.
The
Yeah,
Elijah Moore
please.
battery, man. But no,
Oh
other than
yeah, we're
that,
getting
yeah.
Elijah Moore back.
Yeah, and then other like I said, I do think, like I said, for the elements of just revealing more of the truth that Broncos Texans is definitely something that's going to illuminate, I think, how we feel about both of these teams, big picture.
Yeah, I think that that's fair as well. All right, well that's it for us. We got through another week heading into week 13. Hope your fantasy teams are doing well. We'll be back next week to talk about it all, real or fake, week 14. Like I said, I'll be on the podcast again here in a few hours talking with Todd Burrows about the DFS and betting slate. So make sure you check that out. If you listen to us live, 7:30 Eastern over at the Sharp Football YouTube channel, go and check that out. Go to the website. Remember, use code ANGLES for 15% off. And yeah, we'll be back to talk to you next week.